May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. This isn't going to be a hockey sermon. Although it's conveniently be one, so I'm not dealing with a grieving parish. So, what I am going to preach on is something like I mentioned at the beginning of the service. For some reason, the way that the lectionary is set up, the further you get into the season of Epiphany, the more rare these readings get. And now that we don't always get the seventh Sunday after Epiphany, because things change, and I think next week we're starting with Ash Wednesday. So apparently, the way that things line up with Matthew and various things, this is the next time we'll find this reading is 10 years from now, and this is one of the only times in our lectionary that we hear the words of Jesus to love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you. So I feel kind of an obligation to preach on precisely that, on loving our enemies. So I'm going to begin by reading this bit of a passage from somebody named L. Gregory Jones. It's called Talking with the Enemy. In Wendell Berry's novel Jayber Crow, Jayber is a barber in Port William, Kentucky, who interacts with a variety of people as they come into his barbershop. He struggles to get along with Troy Chatham, an acquisitive agribusinessman whom Jayber thinks is destroying the land in their county. And to make matters worse, Troy has married Mattie, the woman whom Jayber has secretly admired for several years. It is the late 1960s, and divisions in America over civil rights and the Vietnam War have emerged in Port William. Troy is a fierce supporter of the U.S. government's policies, including the war. And one evening in the barbershop, Troy starts talking about how much he hates the war protesters. He says, "They ought to round every one of them SOBs and put them right in front of those communists, and then whoever kills who, it'll be all for the good." There was a little pause after that, and nobody wanted to try to top it. It was hard to do, but I quit cutting hair, and I looked at Troy and said, "Love your enemies, bless them that curse you, and do good to them that hate you." And Troy jerked his head up and widened his eyes at me and said, "Where'd you get that crap?" And I said, "Jesus Christ." And Troy said, "Oh, it would have been a great moment in the history of Christianity, except that I did not love Troy." I like that a lot. It describes very much something that I very instinctively do. Almost every time I hear the phrase, "love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you," I immediately imagine somebody else loving somebody else. And I wonder if we all instinctively do the same. This story immediately conjured to mind a lot of conversations I had when I was in seminary when the war in Afghanistan was ongoing, the war in Iraq was upcoming, and I felt like I was absolutely correct that the war in Iraq was a really bad idea. And I had a lot of military veterans in my seminary, and they were very loyal to the military and thought it was an excellent idea. And we had a lot of epic debates back and forth, and I had a lot of zingers. I was also 22 and knew everything. And this could describe so many of my victories. It would have been a great moment in the history of Christianity, except I did not love them. It is so easy to preach this gospel to other people about how they should treat them or how they should treat us. You should love them. You should love me. They deserve it, and I deserve it. Jesus wants you to love them. It's very easy to preach. You need to love them. And you can imagine these arguments that so many Christians have. "I'm so angry with you for not listening to me, for treating those other people the way that you do." saying what you're saying or how you're talking to me. I'm so angry with you, I can't imagine us being friends anymore, or going to the same church, or breaking bread together. I cannot reconcile with anybody who could be so unloving. I could never love you for not loving your enemies. Right? Jesus says if we want to take the speck out of our neighbor's eye, we're going to have to take the logs out of our own eyes. It is so hard to see ourselves clearly and our actions clearly once anger takes hold. Our enemies are almost never, especially these days, people from other countries. They're almost never strangers. Our enemies seem to be these days, people that we know. Our enemies are people we know their first and their last names. We know something about them. We know what kind of car they drive. We know their age, their family situation. We know a lot about them. And it's those things that we know about them that make them our enemies. And we don't like them. And to love them is a very difficult thing to do. Because when you're in a relationship with someone who is your enemy, to love them means that we must change something about ourselves. We have to compromise something that we see as essential to come close to loving them. And I'm the first person to say, I do not want to change myself and my beliefs and my values and what I know to be right. It is so important for me. And why would I compromise that which I know to be true for the sake of somebody who is my enemy and maybe a little bit of a jerk? Right? Those two don't really add up. And yet, as Paul said last week, love never ends. As far as prophecies, they will come to an end. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will come to an end. There is something eternal and powerful and world-changing about loving somebody that any piece of knowledge can't compare with. The greatest of prophecies cannot compare to love. The greatest of cultures cannot compare to love. There is something that is deeply world and life-changing about loving someone. And I can tell you from my experience in seminary, because of course I had all these zingers, and I made swift enemies with a variety of people, and then they were still in the cafeteria the next day. And they were still with me for another 2.5 years. And something happens when you spend that amount of time, and when people help you move, and you borrow somebody's truck, and somebody washes your feet. I can recall an ex-Air Force colonel washing my feet on Maundy Thursday. And I could never see him the same way again. He embodied the face of Christ in that moment, and it's very difficult to be enemies with someone who can embody the face of Christ in a moment. And I can tell you that the love that I found loving people who were my enemies was far more transformative and formational and life-changing than loving other people who were kind of like Canadians, who kind of agreed with me on every issue. They're still very much my friends, but the transformation that happened to me in that place was very much through loving people who were my enemies. And I changed. And one of the reasons I changed is because I didn't realize it at the time, but my world was very, very small. And their world was also very small. They had never met anyone like me, and I had never met anyone like them. And we grew and changed, and our worlds grew and changed. And we became bigger. Our souls became bigger in a way that neither of us could have imagined. And it strengthened us, and it strengthened the church. It strengthened our faith. As I compromised the very essence of my beliefs and who I was for the sake of love. even though I fought it so much when these conversations began. I feel in the same vein, talking about loving our enemies, I feel like I have to address relationships that can become abusive. It's very different. In a lot of these kinds of situations, life, the human right to life, always takes precedent. We have a right to live, each and every one of us. And there are people who work very, very hard to fight violent or to deal with violent enemies and to love violent enemies. And we have a deep responsibility, and people we care for, to remove ourselves from situations where our life is in danger. It trumps everything. But what often happens to us after we remove ourselves from those relationships and find a place of safety is, in its wake, is a deep well of fear and a deep and seething anger. How could they have done that to me? How could they have done that to the people that I love? And that anger is powerful. And it can destroy us as readily as any physical harm. And that's where we must learn to love again and find forgiveness. For us, it can be deeply, deeply harmful for us to hate. We are called to love our enemies, and that love changes us, and that love changes them. It makes our church bigger, more holy. It nourishes our souls. It changes us into better people. And it is incredibly hard for us to do because we must risk who we are to become someone who we have not yet become. But that person is closer to Christ and closer to love and closer to God. Amen.